like to invite Shubhangi Gupta from World Resources Institute to talk about the critical nexus of GHG accounting, target setting, and in identification of mitigation opportunities. Over to you, Shubhangi. I'm sorry, I'm skipping your introduction.
Hi, am I audible now?
Yes, clear.
Great. Thanks, Megha. So I'll dive right in. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So over the last 1.5, 2 hours, we've talked about why GHG accounting and reporting is relevant to MSMEs, and we've also covered the basics of how GHG accounting can be done using the corporate protocol standard. But what is the utility and application of this accounting and reporting? Mr. Khotale very succinctly highlighted some of the applications, and that's what the section on GHG management is going to cover in some detail. So GHG management can be divided into 3 stages. The first is periodically quantifying and reporting emissions, which is what Subrata and Atik covered in detail. One point to note here, which Subrata also talked about, is identifying a base year. And although the base year itself is independent of the calculation of your emissions, it is a very important component of the process for 2 reasons. One is to be able to compare your emission trends over time with respect to that fixed base year. And the second is for setting an emissions target in a future target year, again with respect to that fixed base year. And a very important consideration here, as Shubhika mentioned, is that the base year emissions must be representative of the current emissions in terms of organizational boundaries. So it must, in case there are changes in the calculation methodology or in the boundaries, then that base year must be recalculated. And once your GHG inventory from the base year till the present year is complete, we can proceed to the next step, which is identifying GHG reduction opportunities and target setting, which I'll get into a bit more detail. Next slide, please. Okay, so in order to identify the reduction potential for your company, there are 2 steps you would need to follow. The first is to identify what your key sources of emissions are and how they are changing over time. These are called the level and trend analyses. The level analysis highlights your key sources of emissions in every year and has been represented in the graph on the side by the 5 sources if you go from top to bottom, those 5 lines. So the one on top has the highest share, and as you go down, the share keeps reducing. The trend analysis, on the other hand, shows you how each of those sources are changing over time. So if you look at each line horizontally, the trajectory of each line. This is important to consider while assessing your mitigation opportunities, because as you can see in the graph, perhaps you'll find that a source which was initially high in its share of the total emissions is actually falling over time, like source 3, the gray line that you see. And maybe your source which had an initial smaller share is rising over time, like source 4, which is the yellow line. So maybe it would make more sense for you to focus on the yellow line instead of the gray one, given the trends it projects in the future. So together, these 2 analyses give you a holistic picture of what your emissions of your emission sources and thus what to focus on. Next slide, please. Step 2 is to determine how much influence you as an organization have over each of these key identified sources of emissions from the previous step. Typically, by definition, as we heard earlier, the definition of the 3 scopes, an organization's influence will be maximum over their scope 1 emissions, obviously, followed by scope 2 and then scope 3. And this can help in identifying which key emission sources you can actively mitigate yourself. A simple example here is electricity, which is your scope 2 emissions. And let's say, for example, it's the highest source of emissions, highest source in your emission mix as identified from the level and trend analysis. Assuming you get this electricity from India's grid, the emissions from that can be calculated by multiplying the amount of electricity you've consumed in a period of time by the emission factor of India's grid electricity, which Atik talked about. So by definition, if you want to reduce your scope 2 emissions, you can reduce either one of these 2 variables, right? But while, of course, you have control over the amount of electricity you consume, you may not have as much control over the emission factor of the electricity that you do use. So this highlights what you should focus on first, which would be to reduce your electricity consumption, perhaps through energy efficient technologies. And then maybe in the longer term, as alternative sources of clean energy become cheaper, like renewable energy, you can switch to those to reduce the emission factor. Next slide, please. Thus, bringing these two previous steps together, you can identify a subset of your emission sources that you can mitigate such that they are high impact in terms of share of your total emissions, as well as the degree of influence you hold over these two emissions. So that smaller subset is the yellow part you can see in the circle. These identified mitigation opportunities can then be converted into concrete targets through the target setting. Next slide, please. Target setting is the third phase of GHG management. GHG reduction target is a formal commitment to reduce the GHG emissions from your organizational activity. This target must be defined in terms of a specific quantity in relation to a fixed base year in the past and must be time bound. That is, the target should be aimed to be completed in a specific target year in the future. Next slide, please. Based on these three principles, there are three considerations while determining a target. The first is the type of the target, that is whether it is an absolute emissions target, which is defined in tons or metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or it can be an emission intensity target, which is the amount of emissions per unit of physical output that you have, like tons of cement, for example, or economic output like revenue. Both of these options have their pros and cons. An absolute emissions target leads to an actual quantity of emissions to be reduced, but as a result may not necessarily track efficiency improvements, as a reduction may be due to a fall in the output rather than the emission reduction activities. Like during the COVID lockdown, for example, because operations were shut, the emissions went down, but that's not because of specific emission reduction activities. On the other hand, an intensity target allows you to track that efficiency of emissions with respect to your physical or economic output, but may not lead to an actual specific reduction in an amount of emissions, because even though your efficiency improves, your emissions can also still keep rising if your output also rises. So usually, typically, both targets, like both versions of the targets are said to be, should be looked at. Next slide, please. The second step in target setting is to identify, or the second consideration is to identify which emission scopes you would like to set a target for. This can be determined from the level and analysis and the organizational influence steps I talked about earlier. And the third consideration is the target year for which the target must be determined. Usually, this is done over 3 time frames: the short term, which refers to the next immediate 5 years, the medium term, which is from the 5th to 15th year, and then the long term, which is usually a carbon neutrality target for 2050, if the company would like to adhere to the global commitment to limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, which is the target, which is a global commitment that has been determined by a community of climate scientists at the IPCC. Next slide, please. Finally, using these decisions, the kind of target that you commit to can be determined. There are different types of targets that an MSME can adopt, such as energy efficiency, renewable energy, reducing process emissions, all of which Mr. Dale covered, and also a science-based target, which is a target that makes the company compliant with climate science and the global commitment to limiting global warming to either 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would include reducing your emissions by 50% by 2030 from a base year of 2018, or 2 degrees Celsius by reducing emissions by 30% by 2030 from a base year of 2018. So this brings me to the end of my session. I apologize for going over this really fast in the interest of time, but these are the different kinds of targets, such as energy efficiency and renewable energy, that are highly relevant to MSMEs. And thus, we will be dedicating specific sessions in this training series in the coming months to them, where we'll cover the various options and technologies available for MSMEs in India. And yeah, giving it back to you. Thank you.